everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Tatty Rogers. She was a woman from North Wales who one day in early 2008 just suddenly disappeared without a trace. When Tatty was reported as missing, it wouldn't be too long before the police identified a suspect in her case, and even though they hadn't found her body, they soon became convinced that this suspect was responsible for her murder. However, proving that was going to be difficult for the detectives. But quickly before we get into the case, I would like to say a huge thank you to Babbel for kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Babbel is a language learning app, the best app of its kind in my opinion. There are so many different languages that you can learn on there, from German to French, Italian, Russian, Swedish, Norwegian, the list goes on. But the language that I'm currently learning on there is Spanish. I actually learned yesterday that aprendo español means I learn Spanish, and I've literally just booked a holiday to Spain for next year, so I'm so determined that by the time I go, I will be able to speak to and have conversations with the people there. So of course I'm using Babbel to help me do that. Babbel teaches you real-world practical conversations, and the lessons themselves are designed by real language teachers. And I've said it before, I know, but I will say it again. The reason I love Babbel's approach is because there are multiple different ways to learn on the app. They'll teach you the language through podcasts and videos and games, as well as the standard, you know, reading, writing and speaking tasks. So you never get bored because you're not constantly following the same method all the time. One of my favourite ways to learn on Babbel is through the speaking task, where they say a word or a phrase and you have to repeat it back. I'm finding that that's one of the best methods for me right now. It really helps me to memorise.
Mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto.
Hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto. 10 out of 10. So if you would like to start your language learning journey on Babbel, then I would say right now is the perfect time. We're getting into autumn. The season of learning is upon us. People are going back to school and college, so why not challenge yourself and broaden your horizons by expanding your vocabulary? If you go through the link in my description box, you will be able to get an incredible 60% off of your Babbel subscription, or you can scan the QR code that is on screen right now. Again, a massive thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to you guys for always supporting the sponsors on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. So for this week's case, we are going back about 15 years now to 2008 in Gwersalt. I'm really sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, but Gwersalt is a village located in Wrexham County in North Wales. And this is Tatty Rogers. She was a 41-year-old woman who lived in Gwersalt on her own. Tatty, who was mainly called Tatty by those that knew her, was born in August of 1966, I believe, and she was originally from Indonesia in Southeast Asia. And she lived there in Indonesia for most of her life, all throughout her childhood and early adulthood. And then when she was around 30 years old, in the mid to late 90s, she moved to Wales with her husband. His name was Jason, and she met him in 1995 during his travels in Indonesia. They hit it off, they soon got married, and they decided to relocate to North Wales. That's where the newlyweds decided they were going to settle down. So as you can imagine, this was such a huge life change for Tatty. She was moving away from the place that she had always known as home, and she was moving so far. She was moving away from her family and her friends in Indonesia, which I'm sure would have been so difficult for her. But it appears as though she quickly settled in Wales. Wales. She made new friends, some of which were of the same culture, which of course was really important to her. She started working. At the time that this case took place, she had a job at a dairy farm in Wrexham. So things were going well for Tatty, but then in 2004 her life was turned completely upside down when the decision was made for her and her husband to separate. And according to sources, Tatty was the one who took this the hardest. I don't think that she necessarily wanted to get divorced, but alas, it happened, and Tatty was living on her own now. She didn't actually go back to Indonesia. She stayed in North Wales. She got herself a flat, and by the looks of it, she did start to adjust to this new life as a single woman. She saw her friends as often as she could, and they described Tatty as just being an incredibly loving and warm and loyal friend who honestly just had a heart of gold. One of her friends, Zal, talked a little bit about Tatty's hobbies and her interests in a documentary that I watched. She said that Tatty loved to go out sightseeing, she loved dancing and music, and she was a very strong woman, strong-willed. Some months after she and her husband broke up, Tatty decided that she was going to start getting back into dating again. So she started going on a few dates here and there, just seeing what was out there, I guess, whether she connected with someone, because although I think she was comfortable now being single, she did want more. She wanted to find someone that she could spend the rest of her life with, someone that she could look after and would look after her. So yeah, she started going on the occasional date. She was still working. She just had a very normal, happy life. But then in early 2008, all of that was to completely change when one day Tatty Rogers just suddenly disappeared. Just days into the new year, on the 5th of January 2008, Tatty had made plans to go and visit a couple of friends of hers, her friend Hannah and Hannah's mum Anne. Obviously it had just been Christmas, so she thought that it would be nice to go and see them and spend time with them, have a bit of lunch together and just catch up. So she sent them a text message just the day before, on the 4th of January, saying that she would see them tomorrow. She would arrive at their house in the early afternoon around 1:30. So 1:30 p.m. the next day rolled around, and Tatty's friends were expecting her to walk through the door at any minute, but there was no sign of her. And of course, initially her friends just thought, okay, well, she's probably just running a bit late, even though that was unusual for Tatty, because she was normally a person that was always on time for things. It was very rare that she was ever late, so they did think it was a little bit odd, but they just assumed that maybe she had been held up. Maybe her bus wasn't running on time because she would have had to have gotten on a bus to get to her friend's house. They could think of a few reasons as to why she hadn't turned up yet, but what seemed the most strange was the fact that she hadn't contacted them to let them know that she was going to be late, which again was very out of character for her. If she was ever delayed, usually she would drop her friends a message to make them aware, but she hadn't done that. And so her friends started messaging her. They sent her some text messages just asking if everything was okay and what time she would arrive, etc. They started calling her phone, calling her house phone, but they never got a response. Tatty just wasn't answering. And I think it was then when panic really started to set in. They knew that this was not like Tatty. She was not the type to just purposefully ignore people, so they were worried that something was wrong, something had happened. And so Hannah and Anne decided that they needed to go to Tatty's flat just to make sure that she was all right. So they went straight there, they knocked on the door, but again there was no answer. And following this, their concerns only increased even more. Tatty wasn't responding to text messages, she wasn't answering her phone, she wasn't opening the door. They just couldn't understand what was going on. Her friends really started to panic that something terrible would happen. One of their first thoughts was, what if Tatty's hurt? What if she's injured herself inside the flat and she can't move? What if she's unconscious and she needs medical attention? Hannah and Anne knew that they had to do something, and so they made the decision to contact the emergency services. They got in touch with the police and they asked for help. Because her friends had informed them of just how out of character this was for Tatty, the Wrexham police took this report seriously right from the get-go. And they too were concerned that maybe something had happened to Tatty inside of her flat. Perhaps she had had an accident and she was injured, or she had suddenly become ill. So because of this, officers were sent out to Tatty's home, to her flat, and after they also got no answer from her front door, they decided to force entry into the building. And when they did, they realised that Tatty wasn't in there. She wasn't in her flat, and there was also nothing in there to suggest what might have happened to her. You know, they didn't see any blood, any signs of an accident or a struggle. All her belongings were still there, so it didn't look like she had packed up and gone away. Nothing appeared out of place. It just looked like a normal lived-in flat. In fact, there was even a pot of food on the stove. The stove wasn't on, obviously, but there was food on it, suggesting that she had recently made it and she intended to eat it later. There was nothing strange about her home, nothing that stood out as odd. But then where was Tatty? Why had she just vanished all of a sudden? After conducting a quick search of her flat, the police actually discovered a little address book or phone book which belonged to Tatty, and it obviously had the names and the numbers of everyone that she knew, her family and friends. And so one of the police's first lines of inquiry was to basically get in touch with all of the people listed in this book and ask them if they knew anything about Tatty's whereabouts, if they had seen or heard from her in the last 24 hours or so. So they started doing that, going through this address book, and another item that they found in her home also provided police with another potential lead. They discovered a supermarket receipt, and the date and time on the receipt showed that Tatty had been to the local supermarket in the evening, early evening of the 4th of January. So just the day before she was reported as missing, the day before she was due to go to her friend's house for lunch. So with this information, the police decided to go to that supermarket and ask the manager if they could have a look through the shop's CCTV footage from that day. And sure enough, Tatty was on it. She was spotted entering the supermarket, she was spotted inside the supermarket and leaving the supermarket, and nothing seemed amiss. She seemed fine, perfectly normal. However, this appeared to be the last sighting of her. The police believe that it was after this when she disappeared. Wow, she obviously made it home because the receipt was at home, but it's believed that after this she disappeared because there were no other sightings of her. And the police really could not work out why she had disappeared. I believe there were a couple of different theories floating about in the beginning of the investigation. There was a theory that maybe she had just decided to go away for a while on her own. She left of her own accord. Although, to be honest, that theory did not seem likely at all. As I said, there didn't really seem to be anything missing from her flat. She had left her coat on the side. I don't believe any clothes were gone, and surely if she had gone away, she would have packed some of her stuff to take with her. There was also a theory that she had been involved in some kind of accident, maybe a car accident or something. And then there was the theory, which of course would have been the worst case scenario, the theory that the police and everyone feared the most, that foul play was involved in Tatty's disappearance, that she had been abducted and possibly even murdered by someone. Now, like I said just a few minutes ago, one of the first things detectives did as part of this missing persons investigation was they started contacting everyone in Tatty's phone book just to find out if they could provide any details that may have been relevant to the case. And through this, they did receive some very interesting information from a friend of Tatty's, a man named Lucas Respondet. He was, I believe, aged around his early 30s at the time that this case occurred. He was originally from Poland, however he relocated to Wrexham in Wales just a couple of years earlier in 2004. He lived with his family. He had a wife and 2 children, 2 sons, and it turns out actually that Lucas and his family lived with Tatty Rogers for a while. You see, when Lucas first moved to Wrexham, he actually came alone. He came over to, I think, find work, and he started working at the same place where Tatty worked, the dairy farm. That's where he met Tatty, and they became very good friends, such good friends in fact that when Lucas's family moved over to Wrexham not long after this, Tatty allowed them to stay in her flat in Gwersalt until they found their own place. Now, after going through Tatty's phone records, the police discovered that the very last person she spoke to before she went missing was Lucas Respondet. So, of course, the police were very keen to speak with him. Maybe since he was the last person to speak with her, he could provide some information on her whereabouts. Maybe she mentioned to him in their conversation that she was going somewhere, or maybe he was even involved in her disappearance. So the police got in touch with him, and he said that over the last few weeks over Christmas he'd been in Poland with his family. He'd gone back with his wife and his kids, and then he returned alone in early January because once again the rest of his family planned to return at a later day. But he came back on the 4th of January, the same day that it's believed Tatty went missing. And Lucas actually said that he did see Tatty that day. He said that that evening he went round to her flat and he gave her a present, a Christmas present. He said that she was really happy to see him. They had a bit of a catch up, and then she actually asked him if he wouldn't mind giving her a lift somewhere, if he could drive her to Wrexham because she was going to go and visit some friends. I'm guessing that these were different friends that she supposedly intended to visit, not Hannah and Anne, because obviously she planned to see them for lunch the next day. But anyway, Lucas said that Tatty asked him for a lift to Wrexham. He gladly said yes, and so that is what he did. He said that he dropped her off on a road called Mould Road in Wrexham. He said goodbye, and that was the last time that he saw her, the last time it seems anyone saw her. Now, because he had openly admitted that yes, he probably was the last person to see her, Lucas Respondek did become a kind of potential person of interest to the police. Not because he had necessarily done anything suspicious, like I said, it was purely just because he provided the last sighting of her, so the police have to look into him a bit more. And so they asked if he wouldn't mind providing them with his electronic devices, so his phone, his computer, his laptop, just so they can have a quick search through them. And he said yes, of course, that was fine. He was very willing to cooperate. In addition to those items, the police also took Lucas's camera and a sat-nav that he owned, and Lucas gave them permission to also seize his car for them to search. So all of these things were collected, and the police got to work on going through each of them. And in the meantime, as the days went by and there was still no sign of Tatty, the detectives decided to conduct a full-on thorough search of her flat. They actually sent a forensic team in to search to see if they could find any evidence such as DNA, fingerprints, blood spots, anything that might suggest what had happened to Tatty. But again, just like the initial search, they didn't really find much. Again, there were no signs of a struggle, so it appeared as though if foul play had been involved in Tatty's disappearance, it hadn't happened inside of her flat. This probably was not a crime scene. However, something that they did find in Tatty's bedroom, actually on her bedding or her mattress I believe, was traces of semen. Now this did confuse the detectives, I think, because as far as the police knew, Tatty was a single woman, and they had been informed by her friends that Tatty wasn't normally someone that would sleep with a man that she wasn't in a committed relationship with, that she wasn't married to, because she was a very religious woman. So why was there semen on her bed, and could it have potentially been linked to her case? Could Tatty have perhaps been sexually assaulted by whoever was responsible for her disappearance? So after discovering this semen, samples of it were sent off to the lab for testing. The detectives wanted to see if they could determine who it had come from, but back then in 2008, these kinds of tests were going to take time, so it was kind of a waiting game for now. As they were waiting, like I mentioned, the authorities were also going through Lucas Respondek's electronic devices, and what they found on his computer and laptop was truly horrifying. They didn't find anything relating directly to Tatty, but they did discover a lot of child pornography on there. Countless indecent images of young children were found. This man was a paedophile, so he was immediately arrested and charged for this offence. He was charged with possession of illegal images of children. Whilst he was waiting for his court proceedings and his trial for this charge, he was released on bail. And of course, the detectives investigating Tatty's sudden disappearance immediately became incredibly incredibly suspicious of him. Before, they were a little bit skeptical of him because he was the last person to see her before she went missing, but they noted how cooperative he was and how he willingly gave over his belongings to be searched without a fuss, so he didn't seem like he was guilty of anything. But now that they had found these awful, disgusting images, now they knew that he was a paedophile, they became so suspicious of him. Obviously, him being a paedophile doesn't prove that he did anything to Tatty, a grown woman. It doesn't prove that he had something to do with her disappearance, but it does prove that he was someone that couldn't be trusted. It proves that he was someone that was very much capable of doing abhorrent things. So what else could he have done? But child pornography wasn't the only thing that experts found on his laptop. Eventually, they actually discovered that, I believe after Tatty vanished, he'd Googled some very, very incriminating things. He had Googled things like, what happens to dead bodies? How long do dead bodies take to rot and decompose, etc.? So it was following the discovery of all of this when Lucas Respondek basically became the top suspect in the investigation. And even though they still didn't know where Tatty was, they hadn't found her body, I think the detectives became pretty convinced that she had been killed by Lucas Respondek. Why else would he be making those searches on his laptop after Tatty's disappearance? Why else would he be Googling how long a body takes to decompose unless he needed to know that information because he was trying to get away with murder? So the police strongly believed that he was a killer, but at this moment in time, they didn't necessarily have the hard concrete evidence to prove it. The only evidence they had against him was circumstantial, if you can even call it that. They still had nothing directly linking him to Tatty's disappearance and murder, so they couldn't do anything just yet. They couldn't charge him. All they could do was keep searching, keep looking for evidence, keep searching the items that he had previously allowed them to take. If you remember, one of these items was a camera. He had his own camera, and after going through the memory card, the police uncovered some images that he had taken which suggested a possible motive that he might have had for wanting Tatty dead. They discovered previously deleted pictures of Tatty on his camera. However, these pictures were of her kind of undressing and posing. They were sexual in nature, so it was then when the police started thinking maybe Tatty and Lucas were actually seeing each other. Maybe they were having a secret sexual relationship. Lucas was having an affair. He was cheating on his wife with Tatty, and it was theorized that perhaps Tatty wanted to be with Lucas for real. Maybe she had deep feelings for him and she wanted them to be in a real relationship. She didn't want to hide it. Maybe she was trying to get Lucas to tell his wife the truth. Perhaps Tatty even said that she would tell his wife, and so Lucas panicked and decided to kill her before she could do so, before this affair was exposed. Now, Lucas himself, when he provided his statements to the police, insisted that he and Tatty were just friends. Very good friends, but that was it, and that was all they had ever been. But these pictures on his camera indicated otherwise, and another piece of evidence that said otherwise was the traces of semen found on Tatty's bed. It turns out that when tests were completed, scientists were able to conclude that the semen was a match to Lucas Respondek. So it was following this when Lucas was brought in for questioning and he was asked about his semen being found. Now, he denied having had sex with Tatty. He actually said that the reason his semen was on her bed was because obviously Tatty had previously allowed him and his family to stay at her flat, and he claimed that he and his wife had had sex in her bed. And when the police spoke to his wife, apparently she confirmed this. She confirmed that yes, they had had sex in Tatty's bed, and the police couldn't prove otherwise. They couldn't prove that that was a lie, so again they had to just continue looking for evidence. Although I have to be honest, that part of the case confused me a bit, because as I understand it, Lucas and his family had found their own place, their own house by the time that this case took place. They weren't still staying with Tatty by this point, so why would there still be his semen on Tatty's bedding? That would indicate that he and his wife had slept together in Tatty's bed recently, but they weren't still living there at the time. And surely Tatty would have washed the bedding since they left? I don't know, that doesn't quite add up to me. Unless the semen was found on the mattress and not the actual bed sheets. I'm not exactly sure where on the bed it was found. It may have been the mattress, and I guess that would make sense why the semen was still on there. But anyway, moving on, one line of inquiry that the police also decided to investigate as part of their case was Lucas's finances. They wanted to look into his bank records to find out if he had spent any money, if he had bought anything strange after Tatty went missing. And they found that the day following her disappearance, so the 5th of January, Lucas Respondek had been to the local DIY shop and he had purchased a number of different things. He'd bought double-sided tape, some polythene dust sheets, a snap-off bladed knife, some gloves and a spade. And these items instantly raised alarm bells. The police immediately had a theory that Lucas had purchased these items specifically because he was going to use them to dispose of a body. It was like his own body disposal kit. It was also found that later that same day he'd purchased a suitcase, a big suitcase from another shop. So again, the police were thinking, could he have used this to get rid of Tatty's body? If he had killed her, maybe he stuffed her body into this suitcase and then using the spade he buried the suitcase somewhere, or he just used the suitcase to transport her body to another location. And it was after this discovery, after they had his financial records which showed that he had brought these items, when the detectives finally felt that they had enough evidence to arrest him on suspicion of the murder of Tatty Rogers. And this was in April of 2008, so about 3-4 months after Tatty went missing. Even though they still hadn't found her body, they were confident at this point that this was a murder inquiry. After his arrest, Lucas was questioned by the detectives, during which he was asked about all of the items that he had bought the day after Tatty disappeared. They asked him why he bought them, what he used them for. His story was that he bought the big suitcase because he literally just needed a new one. He had recently broken or damaged his old one, so he needed to replace it. And he claimed that the things he bought from the DIY shop, so like the spade, the gloves, the tape, etc., he claimed that he bought those items because at the time he was about to start redecorating his house, so he planned to use those things for that. So once again, like the semen on the bed, he had given them, I guess, a reasonable explanation for a piece of evidence that they had obtained. They couldn't prove that he was lying about why he purchased those items. They had no proof that he used them to dispose of Tatty's body, or at least yet they couldn't. They wanted to conduct searches of Lucas's home and his property to see if they could actually locate these items that he brought on the 5th of January. Because if they can find them and they send them off for testing, maybe they'll be able to find evidence, DNA evidence on them, which did in fact prove that they were used to dispose of Tatty's body. So a forensic team searched his home and they did actually find every single item that he had purchased, the spade, the gloves, the dust sheet, everything that he brought from the DIY shop. But it turns out that they hadn't even been used. They were literally good as new, which was weird. He said that he intended to use them for redecorating purposes, but clearly he hadn't used them for anything, including burying a body. So that seemed like a bit of a dead end for the police, but regardless, the forensic searches of his home continued just to see if they could find any other evidence. Maybe they would identify signs of a violent struggle in his house, because as we know, they didn't in Tatty's. And actually they did find a little bit of blood in his house, little tiny traces of blood. However, when tested, it was concluded that this blood hadn't come from Tatty. So there was no evidence in his home that linked to her murder. Still, the only evidence they had against Lucas Respondek was circumstantial at best. There was nothing concrete, and so they couldn't charge him with the crime. They just did not have enough, and they were forced to release him. But that, of course, didn't mean that they were going to stop with building their case against him. They were still as confident as ever that he was their guy. He was the perpetrator. The police had a lot of confusion surrounding the DIY store items, the items that they believed he had purchased as part of a body disposal kit. As I mentioned before, they just couldn't understand why he bought these items just the day after Tatty was last seen alive all those months ago, and he just hadn't used them. It didn't really make sense. But then the detectives came up with a theory. They theorized that maybe he had actually bought all of these items twice. Maybe if he did use them when disposing of Tatty's body, he actually went out again and repurchased them later as replacements. With this theory in mind, they had another look through his bank records, and this time they noticed that about 6 days after Tatty disappeared and 5 days after he bought the items at the DIY shop, he had withdrawn about £200 from his bank account in cash. So after learning this, the detectives had a look through the CCTV footage from the DIY shop from that same day, the same day that he withdrew at £200, to see if they could spot him on it. And sure enough, they did. He was seen in the shop buying the exact same items again. He also purchased the suitcase twice as well, the police eventually established. And as it transpires, he purchased all these items a second time just the day after the police first visited him in relation to Tatty's disappearance. So what they think happened is that he killed Tatty. He then used the tools and items that he purchased during his first visit to the DIY shop to dispose of her body, and then he panicked basically after the police took that first statement from him in which he admitted that he saw her on the evening that she vanished. He realized, crap, they're probably going to look more into me now. They're going to look at my bank records and trace what I purchased from the DIY store to dispose of Tatty's body. So he decided to purchase all of the same items again, but this time using cash, thinking that now they wouldn't be able to trace it back to him. And then if the police ever came looking for the items, which as we know they did, they would be clean. They wouldn't have been used because they were the second lot. Clearly he had gotten rid of the first lot. I hope that all made sense. I'm not sure if I explained that in the best way, but yeah, it was clearly his attempt to cover up the crime. So after they pieced all of this together, Lucas Respondek was once again arrested. He was rearrested on suspicion of murder and he was interviewed. But this time it was clear that he realised he'd been caught out. He couldn't think of any more explanations that he could give. He couldn't come up with a plausible reason for why he'd purchased all the same items twice, and so he just didn't say anything. He said no comment when answering questions, but he maintained his innocence. He claimed that he had absolutely no involvement in the disappearance or murder of Tatty Rogers, and ultimately he was let go once again because they still did not have that solid evidence that they needed in order to charge him and take him to trial. They didn't even have concrete proof that Tatty was dead because still no body had been found. So the case continued, but unfortunately as the weeks and the months went by, it just kind of started to go quiet and go cold. Tatty's friends and family just had no answers. They had no justice for Tatty and no closure. And I imagine for the police working on this case, it must have just been so incredibly frustrating because they were so sure that Lucas Respondek was the one who did this, but they just did not have enough to prosecute him. It was looking like if he was the killer, he really was going to get away with murder. But something that they did after they released him the second time is they actually put him under 24-hour surveillance. They had a surveillance team watch him at all times. The police thought that this might be their best chance at actually finding Tatty's body because, you know, he was still out on bail pending his court proceedings for the child pornography charges, and they thought that whilst he was still essentially a free man, maybe he could lead them to the place where he buried Tatty or disposed of her remains. Maybe he would visit the place where he left her. Maybe he would even try to move the body or something, who knows. So they started watching him, watching what he did, watching where he went, and after a couple of weeks of doing this, just tracking his every move, they realised that one of the places that he would visit quite often was this farmland area in Wrexham, or near Wrexham, not too far from where he lived. And this farmland consisted of a number of fields, just empty fields, I think. So the detectives started thinking maybe this was the place where Tatty was buried, because why else would he continually keep coming to this area? So the police decided to focus on this farmland. They were going to start searching these fields for any spots where the ground or earth looked as though it may have been recently dug up and disturbed. And if a spot did look like it had been disturbed, they would start digging and see if anything was buried underneath it. I believe the searches of this farmland began around September of 2008 time, so about 9 months after Tatty was reported as missing. And just the month after this, in October of 2008, it was finally time for Lucas Respondek to go to court for the child pornography offence. And at the end of his court proceedings, he received a 32-week prison sentence, so about 7-8 months in prison he would have to serve. So I imagine that gave the detectives peace of mind for the time being. Whilst he was behind bars, they could carry on searching for Tatty, and they wouldn't have to worry that he was still out free to hurt someone else if he wanted to. So whilst he was in prison, the searches for Tatty's remains continued. Again, the main focus of the search being the fields within that farmland. The police were using new techniques all the time in the search. They were using aerial photography, so they were taking pictures from above in the sky to see if they could spot any disturbed patches of land. They had metal detectors and search dogs. They obviously had people searching on foot, but unfortunately they just had no luck. The searches went on for months and they were digging up so many spots, but they never uncovered anything. And then roughly just 3 months into his 7-month sentence in January of 2009, Lucas Respondek was released from prison. He was released early after serving less than half his time for possessing indecent images of children, which I think is just absolutely appalling. I don't know why he was released early, but anyway, he was let out, so he was back out on the streets. He was a free man. But as soon as the detectives were alerted to this, they again immediately put him under 24-hour surveillance. And actually, when he was released, the surveillance team noticed that once again he was making trips to the farmland constantly. It was like he was checking on the area, checking if anything had changed during his time behind bars. So this just made the detectives even more confident that Tatty had to be buried somewhere there. And it was then when the police decided that they needed to try and force a reaction out of Lucas Respondek, because you see, up until this point, the whole search operation of the farmland was a secret. The police had kept it completely under wraps that they were searching this area for the body of Tatty Rogers. The public didn't know, the media didn't know, and Lucas Respondek himself wasn't aware that the police were searching this area. But after his release from prison, the detectives decided that maybe it was time to make these searches public knowledge, because perhaps then he might panic, and if he had buried Tatty's body somewhere in the farmland, he might think, oh my god, I need to move her before the police find her remains. But of course, because he was under surveillance, if he did move her, the police would know about it, because he was being watched all the time without his knowledge. And so they did exactly that. The police announced to the public and the media that they were conducting searches in this farmland for Tatty Rogers, in the hopes that this would trigger Respondek into doing something incriminating. And as it turns out, it did have that exact effect. I believe it was just hours after the news of the searches was announced in March of 2009 when Lucas Respondek was spotted by the surveillance team packing some bags into his car. It was at that point when the police began theorising that maybe upon hearing the news, he decided to flee. He decided to go on the run at some point soon soon because he knew that it was only a matter of time before Tatty would be found. Following this, Respondek got into his car and he started driving. So of course the surveillance team followed him, and they followed him to around the farmland area. They actually noticed that he went to this one particular spot where he was kind of high up at the top of this colliery area and he was overlooking the field. He had some binoculars with him. He was actually wearing green camouflage clothes and he just started watching the search teams, trying to keep his head down and hide from them, completely unaware that the surveillance team were watching him. The surveillance team were watching him watching the search operation. They actually took pictures of him during this time. And over the next few days, he continued visiting the area. He went up to that high point and just carried on watching. He wasn't there every second of every day, but he was there often. Like I said, it was like he was just wanting to check in every once in a while to see how the search was progressing. And then during one of the times when Lucas wasn't at the farmland, the police actually decided to go up to that high point where he would kind of overlook the search, I guess, just to see what kind of view he had from this spot. And when they did this, they realised that the fields that they were currently searching and had been searching, he wouldn't have actually been able to see. The view that Lucas had from his watching spot actually overlooked this one particular field that the search team hadn't searched at all yet. So it was then when they thought that they were probably searching the wrong areas. They needed to search this particular field that Lucas Respondek was clearly keeping an eye on. And so they started doing that. They started looking around this one field for possible patches of land that had been disturbed in recent years. Because remember, by this point, Tatty had been missing for well over a year, for about a year and 2 months. And it seemed as though when Lucas Respondek realised this, when he realised that searches had begun in this one particular field, he immediately jumped into action. On the evening of the 22nd of March 2009, the surveillance team observed Respondek leaving his house, walking towards his car, and in his hand he was holding a shovel. He then got in his car, he started it up, and he drove to the farmland. They watched as he drove down this lane, I think towards that particular field where the searches were currently happening. By this time of night, however, the search had ended for the day. The teams had gone home, so there was no one there. And the surveillance team obviously couldn't follow him all the way to the field. Remember, they had to be so careful not to get too close, because if he realised that he was being followed and watched, that could blow the whole thing. So they got to a point after he drove down the lane towards the field when they just had to stop and just wait and see what happened. And around midnight, after Respondek had been in the field for about 3 hours, he was spotted leaving the field empty-handed, which was really surprising to the surveillance team. They thought that they would see him leaving with the body, maybe leaving with the large suitcase that they believed Tatty was put inside. They assumed that they would see him carrying Tatty's remains, putting them in his car, and then attempting to move her and bury her somewhere else. But like I said, that wasn't the case. He was empty-handed. He got back in his car and he drove away. He drove back to his house, actually. He was in his house for a little while, so it's believed that he probably washed, he had a shower, he put on some different clothes. The surveillance team then observed him leaving his house once again and actually going and seeing some friends of his and associates just in the middle of the night. His behaviour was very odd, and it was clear to the police during this whole time that he was very on edge. He was behaving quite erratically. It's believed that he might have been visiting these friends because he wanted their opinion on what he should do. He clearly knew that his time was almost up. The police were closer than ever to catching him for this, so he wanted his friends' advice on what to do. Anyway, he went and visited all these people, and then following this, at about 3 o'clock in the morning on the 23rd of March, the team followed Respondek all the way to the local police station, and there he made a confession. He sat down with the detectives and he said that he was ready to show them where they could find the body of 41-year-old Tatty Rogers. He never admitted that he murdered her in this interview. He wouldn't say the words, "I killed her." He just said that he would take the police to her burial site. So he was arrested for the 3rd time on suspicion of Tatty's murder, and as soon as the sun rose later on that morning, Lucas was taken to the farmland where he showed the police the spot where Tatty's remains were. It actually turns out that he had tried to dig them up prior to this. Remember, earlier on the previous evening, he was in the field for like 3 hours with a shovel and it was pitch black, so the surveillance team couldn't see exactly what he was doing. But the police now learned that during that 3-hour period, he had been trying to dig up the body. He knew it was only a matter of time before the search teams would find her, so he was trying to move her body. However, when he started digging, he quickly concluded that it was just going to be way too difficult, because apparently it wasn't just soil that he was having to dig. A lot of the mud was also clay, which is really, really hard to dig through, and so he quickly gave up and he ultimately decided to just hand himself in. As we know, the next morning he went with the police to the field and he showed them the spot where Tatty was buried. After he pointed out her burial site, the search and forensic teams got to work on recovering her remains, and Lucas was taken back to the police station where he was questioned once again. They were hoping that since he had handed himself in, he would confess to murder and tell them everything, but he actually didn't. Well, he kind of semi-confessed. He obviously admitted that he was the one who buried Tatty's body, but he claimed that he didn't murder her. He was not responsible for her death. Lucas's story was that on the evening that Tatty disappeared, the 4th of January 2008, he went over to her flat to give her a Christmas present. However, when he arrived, Tatty told him that she wasn't really feeling too great. She kept complaining to Lucas that she was feeling quite ill, and so he said to her, "Well, why don't you come and stay with me for a day or two and I can look after you until you feel a bit better?" And Tatty agreed. So they went round to his house. They were having a pretty normal evening. He said that he actually started showing Tatty some pictures on his laptop that he had taken recently because he liked photography. And eventually Lucas claimed that he got up and he went and had a shower. However, when he returned to the living room where Tatty was, he found her collapsed on the floor and she wasn't breathing. Tatty had died just suddenly in his living room. He assumed that it was because she was ill. She kept complaining that she wasn't well, and he thought that maybe that had caused her to pass away. And he said that in that moment he just did not know what to do. He panicked and he just walked out of the house. He left Tatty's body on the floor in the living room, and he left her there just on her own for the next day or two, until eventually he returned and he decided that he was going to hide her body because he was worried about how this situation would look. And so he brought all of those tools and items from the DIY shop, the gloves, the spade, he brought the suitcase to carry her in, and he used the items to bury her body in that field. And then following this, he just, I guess, tried to act as normal as he could. He tried not to raise suspicion. But as I'm sure you've probably guessed, the detectives did not believe this story for 1 minute. They did not believe that Tatty had just died suddenly of natural causes like he was claiming. They wholeheartedly believed that he had murdered her, because if it was just an accident, if she had literally just collapsed and died and he had nothing to do with it, why the hell wouldn't he call the police? Why wouldn't he call an ambulance? Surely that would be any normal person's immediate thought, immediate action. Call for paramedics because maybe they'll be able to save her. But he didn't do that. He literally just left the house and left Tatty's body, and then a few days later he buried her. And to the police, of course, that made them believe that he was lying. He was guilty. He was a killer. And Tatty's post-mortem indicated the same. Obviously, after Lucas pointed out her grave, the search teams started digging and they did recover Tatty's remains. And surprisingly, even though it had been more than a year since her death, her body wasn't actually as decomposed as you might expect. As I mentioned a minute ago, she had been buried in a kind of mixture of soil and clay, and the clay had preserved her body quite well. So after her body was recovered, she was taken to the medical examiner where a post-mortem was performed, and the coroner noted that there were injuries to Tatty's neck area. Apparently she had been buried in the fetal position, so her neck was kind of hunched down, which meant that I think more than anything else was the least decomposed area of her body because it wasn't as exposed. And the coroner determined that she had a lot of damage to her thyroid horns and thyroid gland in the front of her neck, which suggested to him that Tatty had died as the result of manual strangulation. He couldn't be 100% sure that this was the case, I think just because it had been so long since she was actually killed, but in his expert opinion, he did believe that she had been strangled, which would indicate why the authorities didn't really find any forensic evidence in Lucas's home earlier on in the investigation. They didn't find any traces of Tatty's blood, and that would have been because she had been strangled to death. She wasn't stabbed or beaten or anything that would have caused major blood loss. So as soon as they received this report from the coroner, the detectives confronted Lucas Respondek with the information about her neck injuries, and they said to him, "Explain to us then, if you didn't strangle her, how did she get the injuries to her neck?" And he tried to say something along the lines of, "Oh, well, she must have hit her head and her neck when she fell to the floor because she was ill and she collapsed and that's what caused the damage." But I mean, again, if that really was the case, and if Tatty really had just died of some kind of illness that she had, if it really was an accident, why didn't he call for help? His actions after he supposedly found Tatty dead just do not indicate that this was a natural death. They indicate that this was a cold-blooded murder. And so finally he was charged with her murder. However, he maintained his innocence, and so he pleaded not guilty to the charge. Lucas's trial took place at Mold Crown Court in Wales, and it began in November of 2009, about a year and 11 months after Tatty's death. During the trial, his defense team stuck to his story that he didn't kill Tatty, she died of natural causes, and he just buried her body. However, the prosecution presented the court with all of the evidence that the police had collected, which indicated that that was in fact a lie. And at the end of the trial, of course, the jury found Lucas Respondek guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, I believe with a minimum of 18 years. He would have to serve at least 18 years before he would become eligible for parole, and that was in 2009, so obviously he is still in prison today. As far as I'm aware, Lucas Respondek has never admitted to murdering Tatty. He has always stuck to the same accident story, which means in a way, I guess her family and friends have never really had full closure. They've had justice, I guess, but they've never had real answers as to why he did what he did to Tatty, why he decided that she had to die that day. I've come across a couple of different theories of motives that Lucas might have had during my research of this case. Obviously, some of the evidence, those posed pictures of Tatty on Lucas's camera, they do suggest that Lucas and Tatty may have been having a secret sexual relationship. And like I mentioned earlier on in the video, it's been theorized that maybe Tatty wanted to take it further. She really liked Lucas and she wanted to be in a real proper relationship with him, and so she was trying to get him to tell his wife, but he wouldn't. And perhaps he was scared that Tatty would tell her, so he decided to silence her by murdering her. That's one theory that a lot of people believe, but as I understand it from a documentary that I watched about this case, most of Tatty's loved ones and her friends don't believe that. They believe what happened is that Lucas killed Tatty because she turned him down. He made sexual advances towards her and she didn't like it. She told him no because, as I said earlier, Tatty was a very religious woman and she wasn't really one to have a sexual relationship with a man unless she was in a committed relationship with him. That just wasn't really her. I don't know if we'll ever know exactly what the motive was because Lucas Respondet clearly has no intention of ever being truthful about this. But that is it for this case. That is the case of Tatty Rogers. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. Also, let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. And also let me know what you think of the background. I've kind of switched it up a little bit. I've actually moved to a different room in my house to film in. So the background is looking a little bit different. Let me know what you think. Let me know if anything needs changing. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you again next time for another mystery with Molly.